100 days. As of today, May 12, 2026, Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 100 days. 100 days since the garage door closed at 9:50 p.m. on January 31st. 100 days since the doorbell camera captured a masked figure on her front porch at 1:47 a.m. 100 days since her pacemaker stopped syncing with her phone at 2:28 a.m. and the digital trail that had documented her life went permanently silent. Today, Sheriff Chris Nanos sat down with 13 News reporter Renee Romo for an interview marking that milestone. His message was specific and deliberate. He said, "They are working hard to get this resolved, and I think every day they get closer." He said he believes, at some point in time, they will make an arrest in this case. And he said something about the DNA that reframes every timeline discussion that has been happening for weeks. He said the labs are having to separate all of the different DNA that was found inside the house and then work to identify who it belongs to. He said it moves at a snail's pace for some people, but for his investigative team, it is doing exactly what they need it to do, because they want to ensure they are doing it right, not just to avoid arresting the wrong person, but to ensure they are able to properly prosecute whoever was involved. Properly prosecute. That phrase carries the investigative direction of this entire case inside it. An investigation that is being built for a courtroom, for a prosecution, for a trial. Every decision about evidence processing, every delay, every choice about what to release publicly and what to seal, all of it makes complete sense when you understand that investigators are not just trying to find out what happened. They are building a case that will hold in front of a jury. And that brings us to what this video is actually about. Because 100 days into this investigation, the forensic and digital evidence threads have been examined extensively. The doorbell footage, the tattoo, the backpack, the cell tower data, the pacemaker timestamp, the hair in the FBI lab. All of it has been covered, analyzed, and documented. But there is a parallel thread in this investigation that has received far less careful evidence-based examination than it deserves. The financial dimension. Not as an accusation against any individual. The Guthrie family was formally and completely cleared by Sheriff Nanos, and that clearance stands and is not in dispute. But as the documented investigative framework that explains what experienced law enforcement uses to establish motive in cases involving elderly victims. As the lens that explains what investigators were looking at in the early weeks of this case, before that clearance was issued, and what the documented financial evidence around this case still tells us about how the crime was structured. Before we go any further, subscribe to Unclosed Files and hit the notification bell. Today is day 100 of this investigation, and this channel has been here for every significant development since the beginning. Hit the like button. Drop a comment below with one question. What do you think the motive behind this crime actually was? I read every comment. Subscribe and let us work through the financial picture that investigators built from the beginning. First, the person this is all about. Nancy Guthrie had lived in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona for more than 50 years. She raised 3 children after her husband Charles died in 1988. She attended church every Sunday. She had friends who knew her well enough to notice when she did not appear on a Sunday morning live stream before the police even knew she was missing. She had a pacemaker. She had daily medication for a serious cardiac condition. She wore hearing aids during the day and removed them at night. She could not walk 50 yards without assistance. She lived alone, independently, in a home she had owned for decades, in a neighborhood she had been part of for a generation. She was 84 years old. She was taken from her home in the early hours of February 1st, 2026, by at least one masked, armed person who had conducted surveillance of her property on multiple dates in advance. She has been missing for 100 days. No arrest has been made. No suspect has been publicly named. Now let us talk about what investigators build before they build anything else in a case involving an elderly victim who is harmed within or near their social circle. They build a motive framework. And the primary motive framework in cases involving elderly victims is not rage. It is not revenge. It is not passion. It is access. Access to assets that become available when the person who owns them is no longer present to protect them. That framework does not require suspicion of any specific person. It is the documented analytical lens that investigators apply to the financial picture of any case involving an elderly victim. And in this case, the financial picture has several documented, publicly verifiable elements that are worth examining carefully and precisely. Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina foothills is valued at approximately $1 million. That is a matter of public record, accessible through Pima County property records. It sits in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the Tucson area. Nancy had owned it for decades. The property values of family members living nearby are also public record. The documented gap between what Nancy owned and what other family members owned is the kind of financial information that investigators examine in the early days of any case with this profile, not because it proves anything, but because asset disparity is a documented motivating factor in cases where harm comes to an elderly person from within their extended orbit. The power of attorney document that circulated publicly is the next documented element. In May of 2025, 8 months before Nancy's disappearance, a durable power of attorney was signed within the family. Legal commentators who reviewed the document publicly noted it is standard paperwork, the kind that gets executed during real estate transactions or refinancing. Many legal professionals said it means nothing on its own. That assessment is correct. A power of attorney by itself means nothing, but the role of financial instruments in the motive framework is not to prove guilt. It is to establish whether the financial infrastructure existed that would allow someone to benefit from Nancy's absence. And the answer to that specific, narrow question, did financial instruments exist, is yes, they did. What those instruments mean in the context of this case is a question that investigators have been working to answer since the first days of the investigation. The family has been cleared. The clearance was formal and public and explicitly stated to cover all siblings and all spouses. That clearance is the result of the investigative process working exactly as it should. You examine the financial picture, you examine the relationships, you examine every instrument and document, and the investigation determines what the evidence supports. The evidence supported clearance. The family is cleared. But the financial framework that motivated the early investigative scrutiny remains documented and relevant, not as a basis for suspicion of any named individual, but as the documented landscape of what Nancy owned and who stood to benefit from access to it. That landscape is what investigators mapped in February. That landscape is what any experienced investigator maps first in a case with this profile. Now let us talk about the 911 call, because this is the most analytically significant sealed piece of evidence in this case, and it has not received the careful treatment it deserves. When Annie Guthrie arrived at Nancy's house on the morning of February 1, 2026, she called 911. The family had arrived at approximately 11:56 a.m. The call was placed at 12:03 p.m. That 7-minute gap between arrival and the call is documented in the official timeline released at the February 5th press conference. The 911 recording from that call has not been released, not the audio, not a transcript, not even a summary of what was said or how the call began. 3 months have passed. 100 days. And in a state where 911 recordings are public records under Arizona law, with an exception when the government demonstrates a justified investigative interest in withholding them, this recording remains sealed. Retired Detective Bob Gilliam addressed this directly in a public interview on The Interview Room. His assessment was specific. There is probably some investigative information in there that detectives do not want out to the public. He said, "Do not hold your breath. It will be quite a while before that recording surfaces." And then he said the phrase that carries the most investigative weight of anything he offered. He believes the 911 call likely will not go public until a potential trial date nears. A trial date. That is not a phrase a retired detective with decades of experience uses casually. A trial implies charges. Charges imply an arrest. An arrest implies that the trajectory of this investigation, despite 100 days of public silence and apparent stagnation, leads to a courtroom. And the 911 call is being preserved as evidence for those proceedings. In Arizona, 911 recordings are presumptively public under state records law. The exception that allows withholding requires the government to put forward a specific, documented interest that justifies it. That interest has been asserted here. The call is sealed. The justification for sealing it, The specific investigative interest being protected has not been disclosed publicly. But the fact that it is sealed, combined with Gilliam's assessment that it will stay sealed until trial approaches, tells you something about what investigators believe is on that recording. Something that belongs in evidence. Something that belongs in front of a jury. What might be on a 911 call that would justify sealing it for this long? There are several documented forensic reasons. The caller's voice and emotional register. The exact language used before the dispatcher began asking questions, specifically whether the caller described things they should not have known before seeing them, or described them in terms that are inconsistent with first-time discovery. The background sounds in the call, other voices, movement, anything audible in the space beyond the call itself. The sequence and specificity of information volunteered versus information provided in response to questions. In cases where investigators have concerns about a caller's full knowledge of events, the 911 recording is often the single most analytically significant item in the file, and it stays sealed until the prosecution is ready to use it. The 7-minute gap between arrival and the call is a separate documented question. In a case where blood was visible on the front porch, blood that DNA confirmed was Nancy's, the question of what happened in the 7 minutes before someone reached for a phone is part of the timeline that investigators have been examining. Were they searching the house? Were they calling each other? Were they discussing what they were going to say? The recording of the 911 call, when it eventually surfaces, will contain whatever audio existed immediately before the call was placed. Background sound does not respect investigative convenience. The car is the third financial adjacent element in this case that has not been examined with the precision it deserves. Annie's blue Honda CR-V was seized by law enforcement and held for forensic examination. It was held for approximately 40 days. That is a documented fact. 40 days of forensic processing is not a standard timeline for a vehicle belonging to someone who has been publicly and officially cleared. The standard processing timeline for elimination purposes is significantly shorter. 40 days indicates specific methodical examination for biological trace material, the kind of processing that takes time because investigators are looking for very specific evidence in very specific places. The vehicle was eventually returned. No charges related to its contents have been announced. The family is cleared. But the documented 40-day processing timeline remains in the public record as an indicator of the seriousness and specificity of what investigators were looking for when they had that vehicle. Now let us bring in what Sheriff Nanos said today, because the Day 100 update is the most direct statement about where this investigation stands that has been offered in weeks. He said they are working hard to get this resolved. He said every day they get closer. He said the DNA is being separated and identified at a pace that serves the investigation's needs. And most significantly, he said, I believe at some point in time we will make an arrest in this case. And whoever that individual is, that individual will have a right to a fair and impartial trial. A fair and impartial trial. That is the goal. Not just finding Nancy, though finding Nancy is the first and most urgent priority. Not just identifying the suspect, though identification is what the genealogy pipeline and the DNA work are building toward. The goal is a prosecution that holds, evidence that survives cross-examination, a case that produces conviction. That goal is why the 911 call is sealed, why the vehicle was held for 40 days, why the DNA analysis is being conducted with the patience that Nanos described, doing it right, not just doing it fast. Why FBI Director Kash Patel's public frustration about early evidence routing decisions carries operational weight even at this stage, because the evidence that was delayed in reaching the FBI lab is now there, and the question of what that delay cost the investigation's timeline will eventually be answered in the context of what the evidence produces. The investigation is running. The DNA is being separated. The genealogy pipeline is active. The 911 call is sealed for a reason that a retired detective with decades of experience says points toward trial preparation. The vehicle was examined for 40 days. The financial framework that investigators built in the first days of this case has been mapped, evaluated, and processed through the clearance that was formally issued and publicly stated. And somewhere in the convergence of all of those threads, the biological evidence from the bedroom, the digital evidence from the cell towers and the doorbell camera, the forensic evidence that 40 days of vehicle examination produced or did not produce, the 911 recording that is being preserved for a courtroom. The answer to who is responsible for taking Nancy Guthrie from her home on the night of January 31st, 2026 is being assembled. Sheriff Nanos said it today. Every day they get closer. 100 days. The investigation continues. The family was cleared, and that clearance stands. The financial framework that investigators mapped in February is part of the documented record. The 911 call is sealed and will likely remain sealed until a trial date is set. The DNA is being processed correctly and deliberately. The arrest is coming. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. Submit tips at tips.fbi.gov. The Pima County Sheriff's Department tip line is 520-351-4900. The combined reward exceeds $1,200,000, payable anonymously. Subscribe to Unclosed Files. Hit the notification bell. We have been here every day of this 100-day investigation, and we will be here when the arrest happens. This video was produced for informational and educational purposes, only based on publicly available sources including KOL News, Parade, Men's Journal, AZ Family, CNN, NBC News, and on-the-record statements from Sheriff Chris Nanos, retired Detective Bob Gilliam, and FBI Director Kash Patel. The Guthrie family, including all siblings and all spouses, has been formally and officially cleared as suspects by the Pima County Sheriff's Department. No individual has been charged in connection with this case. All property valuations referenced are publicly available through Pima County property records. The 911 call analysis reflects publicly reported commentary from named credentialed professionals. This channel has no affiliation with the Guthrie family, the Pima County Sheriff's Department, or the FBI. Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home. 100 days. The investigation is still running. The arrest is coming. Let us also examine what the motive question has looked like from the perspective of experienced behavioral analysts, because the two primary theories that have been operating in parallel throughout this investigation are not equally supported by the documented evidence. And understanding which theory the evidence more strongly supports changes how you read every piece of the financial picture. Theory 1. Financial motive. A crime targeting Nancy Guthrie specifically because of what she owned and what her death or permanent incapacitation would make available. This theory is supported by the ransom notes, which prosecutors and family attorneys have said appear authentic, at least in some form, but undermined by the Bitcoin wallet that has never recorded a single transaction, the two ransom deadlines that passed without any follow-through, and the total communication collapse that retired FBI agents have described as inconsistent with a professionally motivated financial operation. Professional kidnappers maintain contact because the victim is the asset and payment is the goal. This operation did not maintain contact in the way a financially motivated operation would. Theory 2. Psychological or stalker motive. A crime targeting Nancy Guthrie not for what she owned, but for who her daughter is. Former FBI profilers Jim Clemente and Jim Fitzgerald both arrived at this conclusion publicly. The theory is that someone with a fixation on Savannah Guthrie, who could not gain access to Savannah directly, turned toward the most reachable and most emotionally significant person in Savannah's life. The ransom notes under this theory were not a genuine financial demand. They were theater. Communication designed to create the appearance of a professional kidnapping in order to control the investigative narrative. The USD phrasing, the specific insider details about Nancy's Apple Watch and clothing, the erratic communication pattern, the dead Bitcoin wallet. All of these are more consistent with someone constructing a performance than with someone executing a genuine financial transaction. If the psychological motive theory is correct, the financial framework investigators mapped in February does not lose its investigative relevance. It simply becomes the framework that investigators methodically eliminated rather than confirmed. The clearance of the family is the documented record of that elimination. They examined the financial picture. They examined the relationships. They examined the vehicles and the DNA and the phone records and the 911 call, which they are still holding. and they issued a clearance. The financial picture, thoroughly examined, did not produce the evidence required to sustain a different conclusion. The clearance is the result of that process working correctly. What the financial lens still provides, even after the clearance, is the documented context for understanding what made Nancy Guthrie a viable target in the first place. Whether the motive was financial or psychological, the operational opportunity required a specific set of conditions. An elderly woman living alone, without monitoring, without daily check-ins, without a caregiver, in a neighborhood with a known security infrastructure that was studied in advance. The financial value of what she owned is part of what made her address worth studying. The social position of her daughter is part of what made her emotionally significant to whoever chose her. Both motive frameworks converge on the same operational opportunity, the specific vulnerability of a specific woman in a specific home. And that convergence, whether the motive was money or psychology or some combination of both, points back to the documented question that investigators have been working toward answering for 100 days. Who spent 3 weeks studying that address before February 1st, 2026, and who had enough operational knowledge of that specific house to enter from the back, while someone else ran a distraction at the front? The financial picture does not answer that question. The DNA in the FBI lab might. The genealogy pipeline is building toward it. The cell tower data from January 11th and January 24th is being cross-referenced for device patterns. The tattoo visible on the suspect's right wrist is being worked through identification databases. The Walmart purchase records for the Ozark Trail backpack are being analyzed. 100 days of investigation building toward an arrest. Sheriff Nanos said it today. He believes an arrest is coming. He said every day they get closer. He said the DNA processing is doing exactly what the investigation needs it to do. The financial framework is the documented motive context. The forensic and digital evidence is the identification pathway. And the 911 call, sealed for a reason a retired detective says points toward trial preparation, is part of the case being assembled in a prosecution file that has not been publicly opened yet. 100 days. The arrest is coming. And when it comes, every piece of this, the financial picture, the forensic timeline, the sealed call, the 40-day vehicle examination, the genealogy pipeline, will become part of a prosecution record that investigators have been building since the night of February 1st. Doing it right. Not just doing it fast. There is one more dimension of the financial picture that belongs in this examination. One that goes beyond the question of who benefits and toward the documented question of what made this operation possible from an operational planning standpoint. Nancy Guthrie was an 84-year-old woman living alone in a $1 million home in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in Tucson. She had a pacemaker. She had daily medication for a serious cardiac condition. She wore hearing aids that she removed every night, leaving her completely deaf to any sound in her home once the lights went out. She had no overnight caregiver. She had no medical alert device. She had no functioning security monitoring subscription on her Nest doorbell camera. She had no dog. Every one of those missing protections costs almost nothing to address. A Nest subscription is approximately $15 per month. A medical alert pendant is less than $1 per day. An overnight aid through a Tucson home health agency costs a few $100s per week. These are not luxuries reserved for the extremely wealthy. They are standard protections that families put in place routinely when an elderly parent lives alone. The family had the documented financial means to provide all of them. None of them were in place. Now, the absence of those protections does not establish guilt or negligence on anyone's part. Adult children and elderly parents make their own decisions about care levels and independence. Many elderly people actively resist monitoring and caregiving because they value their independence and their dignity. Nancy Guthrie was by all accounts fiercely independent. She drove herself places. She managed her own home. She played cards with family. She chose her own routines. It is entirely consistent with her documented character that she may have declined monitoring that she did not want. But the investigative relevance of the protection gap is not about who declined it or why. It is about what the gap created operationally. An 84-year-old woman who cannot hear anything after 10 p.m., who has no camera recording, no alarm system, no caregiver in the house, no medical alert that would automatically summon help. That woman is, in the documented operational terms of this investigation, completely accessible. Whatever the motive, whoever planned this operation, the planning was informed by the knowledge that the target was accessible. And that knowledge, the specific knowledge that she removed her hearing aids at night, that the cameras were not recording, that no one was staying over, that a 911 call from inside that house after midnight would not happen, is not the kind of knowledge a stranger develops from 3 weeks of surveillance from the street. You can observe a house from a parked car. You can see when the lights go off. You can time the neighborhood's patterns. What you cannot learn from the street is that a specific elderly woman removes her hearing aids every night before bed and cannot hear anything once she does. What you cannot learn from driving past is that the camera on the doorbell does not have an active storage subscription, and the footage is being overwritten rather than saved. What you cannot learn from watching the property is that the security code has not been changed and the alarm has not been activated. That specific operational intelligence, the inside knowledge of how that house worked at night, is the thread that connects the financial picture to the question investigators have been working toward since the beginning. Not who benefits from what Nancy owned, but who knew enough about how Nancy lived to plan around every layer of protection she did not have. Sheriff Nanos has said consistently throughout this investigation that it was not a random crime. The evidence does not support a stranger who stumbled upon a target. 3 weeks of documented reconnaissance, specific knowledge of the security system, the backdoor entry that Jennifer Coffindaffer identified through the lock change, the directional internet disruption that blinded a specific set of cameras while leaving others untouched. The financial picture tells investigators what the motive landscape looked like. The operational knowledge tells investigators who had the access to build this plan. And the DNA in the FBI lab, the genealogy pipeline, the cell tower cross-referencing, and the 40 days of vehicle examination are all threads that investigators have been pulling simultaneously toward the same answer. 100 days. Sheriff Nanos said today, "Every day we get closer. The arrest is coming, and when it comes, 100 days of evidence will be presented in a courtroom before a jury, including the 911 call that a retired detective says has been preserved for exactly that moment. Doing it right, not just doing it fast. Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home, and whoever is responsible for taking her deserves to face everything that 100 days of meticulous evidence building has been assembling. We will be here when that day comes. One final thread deserves direct examination before this video closes. The specific context of what day 100 means for the Guthrie family, and what the documented evidence of their situation tells us about the human reality underneath all of the investigative analysis. Savannah Guthrie has been one of the most publicly visible faces in American news for more than a decade. She has sat behind the Today Show desk through presidential elections, national tragedies, and moments of cultural significance. She has conducted interviews with world leaders and celebrities and athletes. She has been, in the professional sense of the word, composed, trained to speak on camera in real time without losing the thread of what she is saying. In the weeks following her mother's disappearance, Savannah Guthrie appeared on the Today Show, stood at press conferences, posted on social media. But the composure that professional television training produces was visibly strained. In the moments when she spoke about her mother, not as a journalist but as a daughter, the language she used was the language of someone in genuine anguish. She said her family feels the love and prayers from their neighbors, from the Tucson community, from around the country. She asked people not to stop praying and hoping with them. She said, "Bring her home." NBC built a protocol for this case. If news about Nancy breaks during a live broadcast, Savannah is removed from the set immediately. The information is given to her privately and off-air. That protocol is documented and has reportedly been activated at least once, on April 15th. Networks do not build those kinds of internal procedures for cases they expect to go cold. They build them for cases where they expect something to happen, and they want to be prepared for it when it does. 100 days in, that protocol is still active. NBC is still prepared. The Today Show desk still has someone ready to take the anchor chair if the moment comes. Annie Guthrie, her sister, has been quieter in the public space but consistently present in the documented investigative record. Her vehicle was held for 40 days. Her account of arriving at her mother's home on the morning of February 1st is part of the case file. Her clearance, along with the clearance of her husband Tommaso Cioni and all other family members, is documented and on the record. Cameron Guthrie, Nancy's son, has been the quietest of the three siblings publicly. His presence in the investigative record has not been prominently reported. The family has been unified in their public posture. The reward is $1 million from them, not from a law enforcement fund, not from a media organization, but from the family. $1 million offered by people who want their mother and grandmother home. That offering is not the gesture of people who know where she is. It is the offering of people who do not. 100 days of not knowing. 100 days of the specific, particular cruelty of an absence without an explanation. Savannah Guthrie described it in a public interview as the grievous and uniquely cruel injury of not knowing. The sentence is precise. Not knowing is different from knowing the worst. It is its own specific category of suffering, because every day requires its own decision about whether to hope. The investigation is running. The arrest is coming, as Sheriff Nanos said today. And somewhere in the convergence of 100 days of evidence, the DNA in the FBI lab, the 911 call sealed for trial preparation, the cell tower data being cross-referenced, the genealogy pipeline building a family tree from a strand of hair found in a bedroom. The answer that Savannah Guthrie and her siblings and Nancy's grandchildren have been waiting 100 days to hear is getting closer. The financial picture is the documented motive landscape. The operational intelligence is the documented planning capability. The DNA is the documented identification pathway. And when those threads converge on a name, and Sheriff Nanos said today that he believes they will, 100 days of meticulous, patient, prosecution-focused evidence building will have produced what it was designed to produce: a fair and impartial trial. His words, today. Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home. Her family deserves the truth. And the investigation that has been running for 100 days deserves to reach the destination it has been building toward. We will be here for every day that remains.